and welcome to the TrueWorks podcast, the podcast that helps you understand what the gospel is and how it applies to your life and work. I am your host, Joshua Smith, and with me today again is Doug Meikle. I invited you back.
Well, I'm so deeply thankful for that, Joshua. Thank you.
I
really
too.
appreciate that.
Yeah, I couldn't do it without you, Doug.
Clearly.
Yeah. As the viewers know,
As
more
everybody
than,
knows, you could not do this without me. Yeah.
So today, our topic is going to be Murray's, what's his first name again? John
Murray.
Yes,
Yeah.
Good Frenchman, I believe.
Yeah. Joshua, you know he's not French.
He's not French? He wrote in French.
He may have done, but he is Scottish.
He's Scottish?
From the Highlands of Scotland, actually.
Really? Really? You seem to know anytime anyone is Scottish, you're like, oh yeah, Alison McIntyre is Scottish.
What can I say?
Yeah, yeah. It kind of runs in you.
We have shaped the world.
That's true. That's true. And so we're looking at this Scotsman. Is that how you?
No.
No.
Good Lord, man.
help me, Doug. This is why I need Doug.
Someone from Scotland is a Scotsman.
What did I say?
Scot. You say a Scotman or something? I don't know.
Okay,
Anyway,
Scotsman.
you should probably focus on the actual podcast and the book.
So John Murray is our Scotsman for today. He wrote an excellent book called Redemption Accomplished and Applied, and it's one of the books that we go through in our Faith Work Intensive. And today we're not focusing on the entire book. As you can see, I have it here. It's not that big of a book, but my goodness, is it dense. So we're going to focus on the last two chapters, which are the union of Christ, union with Christ, and glorification. You've been through this now 6 years, Doug, the intensive. Can you give some rationale for why we're starting almost at the very end?
Yeah. Well, the book itself, and John Murray is a 20th century author. He wrote this in the, I think, late 50s, 56 or something like that. He wrote the book. And essentially what the book is called Redemption Accomplished and Applied. And the way the book is written is that the first half of it is relatively dense because it goes through many of the biblical terms for the concept of redemption and how that was achieved. Yeah. And then the second half of the book is around redemption applied, how that is appropriated by those who call themselves Christians. And then the book ends in these two chapters we're going to talk about today, union with Christ and also glorification. And in the course of us teaching this for several years, one of the things that has come through to us is that perhaps we need to start at the end with this vision of what happens at the end for Christians. And that vision itself kind of pulls us through the rest of the book. So we're going to start with union with Christ and talk about that a little bit today. That's the kind of organizing principle of the book, and indeed, as far as Murray's concerned, the goal, if you like, of redemption accomplished and applied is that we may have union with Christ and enjoy that with Him forever. And that enjoying it with Him forever, you could kind of call glorification. It's not an exact term in that sense, but I think in the context of this book, I think that's a good way of thinking about it. Yeah.
You know, redemption, redeeming, the redeemed, these are very Christian terms.
Yeah.
And I think perhaps our viewers would share this as well, that when I initially, prior to reading Murray, the first kind of image that pops into my head, the first kind of concept that I associate with redemption is something like the transaction of being saved from sin or something like that. But the central motif, as you said, for Murray is not this kind of salvific thing, but it's this both mystical, mysterious union, this grafting in. Somehow I am now seated in with Christ, and that's where we begin to understand being saved or being saved from sin.
Yeah. So, and this, to some extent, I think it's sort of a tactical mistake that oftentimes this is the way it is laid out. The way that Murray, in fact, lays it out in the book is that we look through all of these things that God accomplished and the words associated with them in the Bible. But what we forget is that the ultimate end that God is seeking to achieve is to restore a relationship with His creation and with us as human beings. So I think how that is termed in the Bible is this union with Christ. And I think it's very important, I think, for us as Christian people, I think, to, again, we've talked about this in the podcast before, is that it's very important for us as people of Christ to think about that relationship being restored, and that relationship not simply being based on our ability to obey certain things, obey commands. Is that, I think I mentioned in the podcast before, is that, once the relationship is restored, we are empowered to live a certain way. It's not the other way around, that we have to live a certain way in order to restore that relationship. And I think that's why we go to union with Christ first, because we want to give you guys a vision who are going to be reading this book about what's the purpose of all of this. The purpose, if you like, guides us through some of the parts of the book that are a bit more difficult to read.
Yeah, and so it gives you that kind of framework and reference of where we're headed.
Yeah.
So when we think about redemption and this central motif of union, what was so interesting to me about Murray is the way that our understanding of union, how it's actually pulling from all these other aspects of how big a deal we think sin is, whether God is permissive about that sin, our abilities, like you were mentioning, to somehow compensate or obey God. All of this is pulled together in this doctrine of redemption. It's not as if redemption stands far off, that we can kind of a la carte pick, this is what I think, God's a jolly guy and He's redeeming us, and what I think about the way I live my life, or what I think about the created order, those are just kind of separate topics that are unrelated.
Yeah.
Murray shows us, no, when we're dealing with doctrines in this kind of systematic way, it's a mural, it's a web that they are all interconnected with one another.
Yeah, one of the images that we use when we teach this class is kind of take the picture from me showing my age a little bit here, Pink Floyd's album Dark Side of the Moon, right? So in the front of that, in fact, the cover is probably just as famous now as the music that was in the album. But there's this picture of white light being refracted through a prism and it breaking up into its various components of light. And I think that's another way of us seeing what this book is ultimately doing, is that the union with Christ is kind of like the white light. That's the that's the kind of the totality of the thing. But what the book shows us, I think, is the refraction of that light into its component parts.
Right. Okay.
And all those parts, if you like, are there in the white light, and together they make that clear white light. But it's also beautiful in its own sense, when that light is put into its components. And I think that's what you're getting with Murray. It's like it's all part of one great whole, one great story. And I think the specific focus on some of those component elements actually also give us a sense of what is God trying to overcome in this relationship fracture between God and His people. What does He need to overcome? And that story of the overcoming, I think, is also just that's pretty powerful when you get your mind wrapped around that this is not something that the redemption of ourselves, being brought back into relationship with God, was a costly, time-consuming, eternity-fulfilling kind of enterprise. So
it's not something that he just like kind of flipped a switch.
It's not like just turning a light on and off. There was stuff to be done, and that's what the book really kind of focuses on. What's the stuff? But we focus on this union with Christ and glorification because we want you to get a sense of what's at the end of that process.
Yeah. So let's look a little bit more in depth to union with Christ, specifically when it begins. Murray's an excellent writer. The translation is excellent. And what was so really encouraging, reassuring to me as I was reading it was that union doesn't begin, in a sense, it doesn't begin when the believer believes, but it begins in eternity past when God elects, when through his, God has always existed, humans have not, the world has not, and he elects in eternity past, and that election is the beginning of the union. And kind of this, on the flip side, that's kind of in the past. In eternity future, when God will put all things right and make all things new, glorification is the eternal future of this union. That's both the furthest back we could go and the furthest ahead we could go. And those who are in Christ, they are both elected and glorified, all within that cosmic. And what we find ourselves in is this kind of time in the middle.
Yeah.
Time in the middle of that.
Yeah, and I think that how does this help us because this is obviously our faith and work intensive, how does this help us in our faith and work journey? It's that those two bookends, if you like, between, the start and the finish, because those are secure for the Christian, then the life here in the middle becomes one of a lot more confidence and certainty. And I think that's something that certainly for this tradition that Murray comes from, is that the celebration, if you like, of the Christian faith is not a celebration of my decision for God. It's a celebration and a living underneath God's decision for his people. And I think that orientation there is what's to say? It's kind of antithetical to the modern mind, who we are at the center of that.
That's
the
right,
individual is at the center of that.
Yeah.
What's liberating about this is that we are not at the center. That God is ultimately taking care of that.
Now, most people, initially hearing that last phrase, they would say, well, wait a second, that's not liberating at all, because now I'm not at the center. I don't get to decide things. I don't get to call the shots, so to speak. There was something before me and after me that's determining things. But I do think you're right. I do think...
Me too.
Yeah.
I also think I'm right.
Yeah, well, you actually always think you're right.
Well, that's true too.
And I'll give it to you.
That's my superpower.
Yeah, yeah. But thank God for your wife who
corrects me.
Yes.
Who corrects me. That is amongst our many roles. But let me try and give you an illustration of that. Is that, and I think this is not such a bad illustration. If you imagine a basketball team where LeBron James is playing in his prime, yeah. So it may well be that you show up on that team with, if you're an NBA player, you have incredible skill. You're one of the top few hundred basketball players in the world at that point. However, if you make that team all about you when LeBron James is on it, you are going to lose. Yeah, you're not going to win. So the ultimate prize, if you like, has to recognize who ultimately is the player, who ultimately in that case is the man, who can really bring it home.
Yeah.
And to some extent, I think, okay, that's a terrible analogy at one level, but it's also an analogy where you have to realize as a Christian who ultimately is bringing this stuff home.
Yeah.
And when you realize, thank goodness, that's not me. Because look, at the end of the day, do you really trust yourself? I think there's a wisdom in not trusting yourself and ultimately saying, no, this is really not about me. And I'm thankful for that, because whenever it's been about me or whether I've had to make the decision,
screw it up.
It's not gone well.
Yeah.
It's not gone really well.
Yes, I relate, because so many times, I've screwed it up. I was struck by that. We live in a time, we live in a culture that me, the individual, is at the center, and that puts all the burden for meaning and purpose on that individual.
Yeah.
So if you can't find, of course, in the Faith Work Intensive, we're particularly focused on work. If you can't find that perfect match, that perfect marriage of meaningful giving back to the world, then you've messed up your whole life.
Yeah.
Good
No, I
luck
think
being fulfilled and satisfied. Sorry.
Yeah.
You've
I think
missed
it's
the
a
boat.
terrible burden to carry.
It is.
You know, I mean,
It's terrible because we were never fit or supposed to carry it.
Ultimately, no. And I think that's the thing, is it's so, and that's also a reason why, and we'll get to glorification in a minute. I think I want to say a word on that before we close this morning. But I think that just keeping with this theme for a moment is that kind of inward turn where it's all about us, what I think one ends up finding is that cannot bear the weight of real life. You know, ultimately, that's the problem, is that if it really is all about me, it turns out I can't hold up that, hold my end of that bargain.
Yeah.
I need something other than me. That's the whole story of the Bible, is that we need something other than ourselves to make a meaningful life and to make a life that we can enjoy forever.
And forever leads us right into the next topic, glorification, which you said it nicely. This kind of is the completion, or the bookend, the end of where all of this is. What will completed union look like? Yeah.
And I think that what I would suggest there is a good way of thinking about that is that, and in actual fact, we're going to get to St. Augustine pretty soon as well, but St. Augustine there takes the St. Paul's vision of being, there I shall know and shall be known. I think that's in 1 Corinthians 13, I think, isn't it? I think so. Something, or maybe 11. Forgive me. I'm not sure.
I will trust it. Just this time, I will trust your memory.
Okay, fair enough. But that sense of know and being known, that is, if you like, our desire, our deepest desire,
our longing,
to know and be known is our deepest longing. In fact, the modern idiom for that, I think, is also something that's pretty prevalent today about, was I seen?
Was I heard?
Was I heard?
Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
So what people are speaking to there is the sense of to know and be known.
Yeah.
That's our innermost longing, that our significance would be recognized. And I think that's the vision, if you like. That's a practical vision of that glorification, that ultimately when we are in our heavenly rest alongside God, that we would know him and be known by him. And that's a more, maybe a practical way of thinking about it as we go forward today. So that's the glorification. Can sound a bit esoteric, if you like, hard to access. But I think to be known and to know God is ultimately kind of the end goal of all this.
Yeah. And I think Murray, and certainly Doug and I, we readily admit that we're not destroying any type of mystery here. Like we're just pulling back the veil of what the scriptures have told us, and what we see is mystery upon mystery. Well, we have a maybe a little bit better sense to understand, but we understand the abyss, if you like, or the radiance rather, not the lack of light, but the shining brilliance of the gospel. When you were talking about that motif that is quite Augustinian of knowing and being known, I can't remember if it's Aquinas or some other, but he said, the most important fact about the human is not your knowledge of God, but God's knowledge of you.
Yeah.
Right. That's where we start, and from that we come to know God. God's always the actor.
Yeah.
Right. We're not at the center. God is the one pursuing in redemption, and he's the one completing in redemption, in glory.
So we'll probably need to finish up in a minute here, but I think that I think that theme, I'd like us as this year's Faith and Work Intensive, what I'd like you guys to be thinking about is just how do we carry this into our work every day. And what I want to suggest to you a little bit is that when you are certain, when you know who you are and you know you are known by God, it gives you an immense sense of freedom of action. That you are free to take a risk or two at work, or you're free to found some new thing. It gives you this immense sense of freedom, that the ends are secure, So in this time in between, there's a bunch of stuff I can do that maybe I'd be scared to do in other circumstances.
Yeah, if it was all up to me, I would be too scared, right, to take these.
I wouldn't take those steps. Whereas I think what we are, I think now is we're empowered to take those. We're empowered to take appropriately the risks that we want to take in our life and our career, and and one of these days we might talk about Karen and I being here in the United States. I mean, we're a crazy, stupid risk that we took as kids because we felt God would be faithful to us, and that there was a road back. Obviously, because I think alongside that, this essence of forgiveness is also important as well. You can take risks knowing that, hey, it's possible to make a mistake, but there's always a road back. And I think that's been a tremendous freedom in our lives at home. And we've come a long way from redemption accomplished and applied, but that's what I want to try and get across to folks.
That's what we want in the intensive,
and that's
right?
what we want in the intensive.
We don't want to stay in great works of theology.
No. It's the stepping out of that really is where the value is. There's a lot of value, let's say, in the contemplation of these things. That's true. But the deeper value is to move beyond them and take them into your life. And that's what we're about in the Faith and Work Intensive.
Well, I think that's a great place to end. Thank you so much for joining us today for our TrueWorks podcast, where we dug into Murray with Doug. We dug with Doug.
Yeah, I guess.
Yeah, with redemption accomplished and applied. If you'd like to hear other episodes, our podcasts can be found on other platforms, or you can check us out on our website, trueworkshouston.org. Thank you so much.